and welcome to an introduction to the main theories of bilingualism that will inform your work with EAL learners. The research field is huge and changing all the time, so this introduction is exactly that, an introduction, and covers the main work which feeds into supporting EAL learners in the classroom. If you want to find out more, the authors mentioned throughout are a good place to start, and you can also access current research through your MyGTCS account. When you log into it, look for the Research tab and then click on the Education Source EBSCO search. There are also 2 excellent books suggested for further reading at the end. Throughout this video, there are points where I will prompt you to stop and think. I invite you here to pause the video and reflect, or even stop and come back to it later. Take as long as you need to work through this. The video without stopping should take about 15 to 20 minutes to watch. This introduction is split into 2 main fields of theory. The first is the importance of a pupil's first language, or L1 as we call it, also known as home language or mother tongue. The second field is about acquiring a second language, or an L2 as it's known. By the end of this introduction, I hope you will have gained a deeper understanding of your EAL learners and what they need, grounded in what we know from research. A lot of the seminal work in this field is by Professor Jim Cummins, a name you will come across a lot if you look at further research. His linguistic interdependence hypothesis states that the more developed the first language, the easier it will be to develop a second language. So in that vein, I invite you here to stop and think. Think about children that you work with. Do you know what their first language is and how developed it is? How can we encourage first language development, given that we know that the development of a first language positively affects how much a child will develop a second language? It is likely that although you may know a child's first language, you may not know how developed it is. In Scotland, bilingual learners are immersed in English medium education, and our job is to support their access to that curriculum. Although you are not responsible for their first language development, we should always encourage this. So encourage parents to maintain and develop first language at home and help raise the status of diversity across the school so children are motivated to maintain their first language. As the hypothesis tells us, this will support their learning in English. Just like an iceberg, you can only see, inverted commas, spoken language on the surface. What you can't see or hear is that underneath it all, people have one central processor. This means they have cognitive knowledge that is transferable across languages. For example, the ability to sequence or predict or match is the same no matter what language it is in. You have that skill, you just need to learn the words to engage with it in a different language. Similarly, you do not have to relearn concepts or subject content that you know already. This is why it is easier to learn a second language the more developed the first language is, because learning in one language is transferable to others. In the last 10 years, Garcia and other scholars have moved the thinking on from that linguistic interdependence hypothesis to what she calls dynamic bilingualism or translanguaging. Here there is that same central processor, but the surface language features are a lot more indistinct. People who translanguage choose any of their language resources to suit the purpose of their communication at any time. So translanguaging is using all your language resources to communicate and learn, not just solely the language of the classroom. This is very much rooted in a social justice agenda. Social justice is a key aspect of the GTCS standards. We are moving away from these monolingual practices in classrooms and towards more multi or plurilingual ones. That does not mean the teacher knowing multiple languages. It's just about recognising and valuing the languages and literacies that children bring with them to the classroom from their everyday worlds, and creating an environment where children are encouraged to use all that they know. An example of translanguaging is encouraging children who share a language to use that as they see fit to discuss a learning task in class. So I'm going to invite you here to stop and think again. What opportunities could you put in place in your classroom to encourage children to use their first language for talk or learning? Some other opportunities are allowing children to talk about a writing task in first language and then write it in second language, or write the story in first language if they're literate, and then translate into the second language. You could read a story and then ask children to tell us what certain words or phrases are in their first language. You could make stories which children can then narrate in both languages that they know. Ensuring children receive that positive message about the value of their first language is key, giving them the space to use whatever of their language resources they feel will best help them in a variety of situations. Moving to second language acquisition, or SLA. I've put in brackets after each point the original work, but I've paraphrased the main idea of these findings for you. So L2, or second language learners, need, firstly, to understand what is said to them and what they read. It must be meaningful and not just sound. So what that means is the input they are getting has to be meaningful, and that's why we use strategies such as using lots of visuals for EAL learners to help them make meaning of the input they are receiving. They also need exposure to language that's just ahead of what they can produce themselves. That comes from Vygotsky's work. They also need opportunities to practice language in purposeful and meaningful ways. So it's not just about receiving that input for the second language, it's about those opportunities to practice it as well. So think about using collaborative group work, think about having plenty of opportunities for talk. And they also need a safe and interactionally stimulating environment so that they're not forced to produce language before they're ready during what's called the silent period. Now, the silent period is what we call that period of time when someone who is new to a language doesn't speak it, but it's not that they're not learning that language. What they're doing is they're listening and they're internalizing and they're thinking about how that language works, and they will produce it when they're ready. It's like when a baby learns a language for the first time. They don't just open their mouth and start speaking. There is that period of time where they're listening, they're internalizing, and then they'll start speaking when they're ready. When you're acquiring a second language, that silent period at the start is much smaller. So it's usually about 6 months, but can be earlier, can be later. But that silent period is a feature of when someone is acquiring a second language for the first time, and it's completely normal. What you should do is just encourage learners to produce language as they gain in proficiency and confidence, but they need to feel in a safe environment to do so. The most important thing any teacher needs to know about working with EAL learners is about the language demand of learning in a second language. The terms BICS and CALP are from Jim Cummins's work, and they describe the different types of language that you need to grasp when you're acquiring a second language. So BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, and that's that very conversational, social, everyday language, the language that you acquire just from being around speakers of that language and picking it up from your environment. Fluency in that takes about 1 to 3 years generally, and that's the time that includes that silent period. CALP, on the other hand, which stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, that's that kind of language that you don't just naturally acquire. It's got to be explicitly learned and taught. So that's that very much that school language, very textbook, very academic language. This takes a minimum of 5 years to develop to even an intermediate fluency, but really a whole lifetime to develop fluently. So let's think in here and do another stop and think. EAL learners, because of this, can often appear fluent, inverted commas, in English because their BICS language is very, very good, but this can often mask that they still require support with accessing the school curriculum. So I just want you to think here for a minute about any learners that you've realised when they start doing a task that they do still need support with that. So when you're supporting EAL learners, scaffolding for the language demand is key. The need for scaffolding applies to all learners and comes from the work of Vygotsky. His zone of proximal development refers to the difference between what a learner can do without help and what they can achieve when they have guidance and encouragement from a skilled partner. So this could be a teacher or another adult or a peer. The term proximal refers to those skills that a learner is close to mastering. EAL learners need scaffolding specifically for the language demand. This is where the mode continuum comes in. Now, this comes from the work of Michael Halliday, who called it the register continuum. But this continuum shows us the development from BICS language to CALP language. The field is the subject matter. Is the language quite everyday and concrete, for example, talking to a friend about your weekend? Or is it more technical or abstract, like in a science report, for example? The tenor is the relationship between the author or speaker and the audience. So is the style much more informal, like you were engaging with a friend, or is it much more formal, for example, if you're engaging with your boss? The mode is how a text is constructed. So is it more spoken-like, such as a text message, or is it more written-like, such as the kind of language you would find in an encyclopedia? All learners need supported to move their use of language along this continuum, but EAL learners, because English is their second language, will need more support to be able to do this. Here's an example of different types of language. So let's think about a topic such as dinosaurs, and let's compare. Firstly, I like dinosaurs. This one is big and scary. And let's compare that with the Tyrannosaurus rex roamed the planet during the late Cretaceous period 65 million years ago. They were carnivores. So that first sentence is much more spoken-like, everyday, informal language, and that's the kind of language that children will use, for example, in their conversations with each other. The second sentence is much more formal and written-like and uses that technical, abstract language that children will need taught and to engage with the topic in a more formal academic way. So again, I'm going to ask you to stop and think here. Think about a lesson that you've done with your class. What everyday language might children use to engage with the topic? And what much more technical, abstract language do they need to engage with it on a more academic level? I hope you managed to think of some differences in your stage of the curriculum of the kinds of language children will use when they're talking informally with each other and the kind of language that they need to access an academic task. When thinking about this idea of language demand, Cummins' quadrant is a very useful tool for planning. The majority of EAL pupils' work needs to be in quadrant B, where there's a very high context to support meaning and understanding, whilst ensuring there's appropriate high challenge. Every teaching activity can be plotted on this quadrant. EAL, and really all learners, need work that follows the arrows, always concrete and growing much more demanding on their thinking until they can make their own leap into the abstract. Avoid setting work in quadrant D. This is where tasks are cognitively undemanding and very abstract. So examples here are things like just copying for no real reason, parroting words. You can consider the quadrant in two ways. Firstly, each quadrant gives you an indication of what children at different stages of learning English might be able to do in their classroom tasks. For example, a new to English child will need a lot of their work set in quadrant A, whereas a much more advanced EAL learner can cope with the increasingly complex nature of the tasks in quadrants B and C. You can also think of it as guiding a lesson or a sequence of lessons. EAL children, no matter what stage, always benefit from a task that gives them a way in, such as a vocabulary game, before you increase the language demand and complexity of the main task, even if they are more advanced. Here is a summary of good strategies to support moving pupils along the continuum based on all this research. So make sure that you always embed language in context to make it meaningful and purposeful. Always build on prior knowledge. What do learners already know, and what have they already found out or developed in their first language? Make sure there's plenty of opportunities for talk and collaboration, that purposeful output. Make sure there's lots of opportunities to also use their first language for any task that they need to. Always try to move from more practical, familiar language to developing the more abstract, technical language. and always try to model the new language or registers so that you're helping learners to see what it looks like to get there. And introduce subject-specific language in context and make it explicit. So never assume that an EAL learner already knows all the language that they need to access and do a task. Make sure you take the time to explicitly teach them what the subject-specific language is. So to summarise, here's the key messages about EAL pupils' learning that we know from research. Firstly, it's vital that a child's first language is maintained and developed, because this is what will help them when they're acquiring a second language. Encourage parents to do this. Try to include first language in the classroom where you can, and help raise the status of diversity across the school so children are motivated to do this as well. Secondly, children do not need to be retaught concepts and things they have already learned. They just need to support to express it in English. Thirdly, language learning needs to take place in a meaningful context. So this is the curriculum. Use the curriculum as your context for learning. Fourthly, EAL, and all learners really, need their work set just beyond what they can do on their own. They need tasks that are scaffolded appropriately to help them get there. And finally, EAL learners need support to develop the ability to use English language in increasingly complex and abstract ways. So when you're planning tasks, think, what is the language demand and what is it that they need to learn? I hope you found that really useful and you can see where this theory and research connects to how we need to support our EAL learners. Here's two examples of some really great books that I would highly recommend if you want to find out more. Thank you for taking part in listening to this video. If you would like to contact us, here's our contact details further. Thank you for listening to this video.